We are live. Who exactly are you and what is it that you do?
I'm Jenny Williamson.
And I'm Genn McMenemy.
And we are Ancient History Fangirl.
Sounds so familiar. I feel like we say that
how we say it on the podcast. I guess that just comes out that way. Yeah, we talk about, I guess we're a really narrative-based podcast. We are twice a month, and we talk about stories from the ancient world. I think when we started this, we envisioned that we were going to basically just talk about everywhere in the ancient world all at once. You know, we weren't sure how we were going to organize it,
but Jenny, you're getting ahead of yourself, right? Because what's unusual about your podcast, as opposed to the other people I've interviewed this week, there's two of you.
There are two of us. So
we need the origin story of how the pair of you actually got together.
Oh, geez. Well, okay, that goes back like ages into college. But the origin of this podcast was we were both like, we'd really like to do a podcast. We listened to a lot of podcasts. And Jenny was like, I want to do a podcast about the ancient world, mostly about history and really dig my teeth into it. And I'm like, I want to do a podcast about the ancient world and mythology, but I also like history. And so Jenny was like, yeah, I don't think we should work together. We have a good friendship. Let's not do that. And
the rest is history.
And then our friendship would be.
Let's not ruin it, Jen. Let's
not ruin it. So in my typical bullish way, I was like, well, I don't want to do this alone because it feels like a lot of work. And also I'm not good with like just talking. I get anxious and don't want to say things. And Jenny's like, but if you'd said that thing, it would be better. So eventually I wore her down and we decided to do this together.
Yes.
And what is it that you guys both did at university?
So I was a English and speech and theater double major, and you were too, weren't you, Jen? Same exact thing.
This was ancient English and Roma-Greco theater, hence ancient history fangirl. Podcast,
Not, we don't have degrees in this subject at all.
All right.
I've loved ancient history since particularly mythology since I was a little kid. I took Latin in high school, and then I was like, I don't think I want to do this again when I'm in college. And then I remember doing quite a lot in theater about Greek protest theater, and I've always been really engaged and interested in that. And it's sort of, I sort of pitched to Jenny, I was like, we could just do a whole unit on that and what that meant and what was going on. And that actually became part of our first episode or second episode.
I think it's the second one. Yeah. There was like a teensy sliver of it. And we've talked about Greek protest theater a little bit when we had like, I think one of our Dionysus episodes, we talked about it. But yeah, we want to do a whole arc on that at some point. I think for me, it was like, my parents were always really, total history nerds. Like they were the kind of couple who went camping on, like Gettysburg battlefield for their honeymoon. And I grew up with history. My mom was the town librarian, and I, she had all these cool history books of, like Stonehenge and the Aztecs and all kinds of crazy stuff. And I just wanted to learn everything as a kid. And that love of history has really continued into adulthood. So,
yeah.
So you decided that your friendship could weather actually working together. So
far we've had some heated conversations, let's say.
We have. We've also texted each other at 2 a.m. in each other's time zones on random times, like just ridiculously random facts that there's no one else in the world who would enjoy this as much as you enjoy it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So how long's the podcast been up and live now?
About 2 years, I think, isn't it, Jen? As of March, it would be about 2 years.
2 years, yeah.
And before we go into the actual subject matter of what you guys cover on your show, what would be the thing which has most surprised you about podcasting in that time?
In that time or in general?
No, in the last 2 years since you've been official bona fide podcasters.
So the biggest surprise to me is how incredible the history community is. Like we launched our podcast. We were both a little anxious about it because we are storytellers and we're writers and we're good researchers, but we are not historians. And right from when we launched, we had so much support of the history community, history podcast fans, and the classics community. And it's been so great to find our place there. And I was terrified. I was like, oh God, people might just not like what we do. We might get something wrong. It just might be I'm very anxious. Have I mentioned that? But the community has been so lovely and so inviting. And I just think, like, to me, that was the biggest surprise.
One of the criticisms of podcasting and history podcasts is that it's male heavy. So was that maybe one of your trepidations of going into the space?
Maybe a little bit, because there are a lot more. I think I haven't done a giant survey of this, but my impression is that there are a lot more male historians podcasting than female historians. But yeah. I think Jen and I really felt like we had something to say and something to contribute to the space. Like, we wanted to talk about things from a feminist lens, and we wanted to, even when telling, male stories, like we did a whole series on Julius Caesar. We're currently in the midst of an arc about Spartacus. We've talked about, a lot of men who are famous in history, but even so, we wanted to bring like a woman-centric lens to things. And I don't think that was like a mission that we started out with, because I don't think we were necessarily thinking about our mission, when we started. I think it just kind of evolved, but we realized that was something that maybe set us apart from a lot of other history podcasts.
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult to read the ancient sources and to not feel at times quite angry about the way they portray women and minorities. And I think as a result, when we were dealing with them a lot more and we were more familiar with where to go for the research we needed, it became very apparent that we needed to speak out in a way that we didn't in our earlier episodes. And since then, we have gone into our later seasons really having, I would say, a pretty feminist feel to our episodes, even when we're talking about males, because so often in history, women and minorities are erased in the favor of a male narrative that would not be possible without both women and minorities. And it's something that needs, especially in the classics, to be, and in ancient history, to be called out and to be, shown more light on.
Okay, sorry, go on, Jenny.
Oh, I was going to say, and we're not the only, history podcast doing work like this either. There are quite a few other history podcasts that come at things from a feminist lens. For example, the Partial Historians, Explore Us podcast, Let's Talk About Miss Baby does work like this. Queen podcast. Yeah, there are other people doing this work, and I think that one of the great things about being in this space is how we've been able to connect with other people who have similar passions like that. That's been really fun.
Yeah.
So okay. I come wrapped up in the physiology. I said that completely wrong. You know what I mean? I've been a guy. I'm a bloke, as we say in England. Give me the female lens on a specific character of antiquity. So myself and other dudes can go, you know what? Yeah, I hadn't thought about him or her in that way.
Do you want to take Caesar and I'll take Spartacus?
Yeah. Okay. This is going to be great. Okay. Yeah. So like I said, we were telling the story of Julius Caesar, and I think it was last year. I was probably in the midst of that arc during the last Intelligent Speech Conference. And this is a dude's story, but there were so many women around him that made a huge difference in his life. We start with his mom, for example, when Julius Caesar was like, I don't know, 18 years old. Okay, this is going to be me getting into the history a little bit, and I don't want to get too in the weeds, but there was this dictator in charge named Sulla, and Sulla was killing a bunch of people who did not conform to his agenda or who sided on the wrong side in the civil war that he had just won. And he was a really scary guy, and there were heads hanging in the rostra and bodies choking the Tiber, and Rome had just been racked with violence over the civil war. And he was rearranging aristocratic marriages to suit his own agenda. And one of the people he told to divorce his wife so that he could marry her to somebody else was the young Julius Caesar, who I believe was maybe 16 or 18. I forget. He's very young. So Julius Caesar said no. And that was a dangerous thing to do. And as a result of that, he had to run off for a time and live in hiding and evade Sulla's, basically armed guards trying to chase him or whatever they were going to do with him. One part of that story that people don't tell a lot is how his mom intervened to get him back in Sulla's good graces. Now, his mom was not a Vestal Virgin herself, but she was very connected to the women's religious community, which was extremely influential in that time. And she prevailed on the Vestal Virgins to pressure Sulla to let her son come back home and to allow him to live and not have all these consequences on him that anyone else would have. And I also would mention that Julius Caesar was the nephew of Marius, who was Sulla's enemy in the Civil War. So he was already persona non grata. It was his mom and the Vestals who basically saved his life by intervening for him in that area. And that's a part of the story that isn't told a lot of the time. It's kind of a footnote. And we tried to draw that out in our episodes on that. We also did a lot of work centering people like Cleopatra. Like, we tried to really focus on her during episodes where she was important. Like, we went back and talked about her life before she met Caesar and her, ambitions and motivations and reasons for siding with Caesar and like trying to get him on side during her own civil war and what her mindset would have been and what conditions she was dealing with. So she wasn't just an adjunct to his story. She was a really important, major main character in that arc. So
I think one of the interesting things that you brought out was a lot of the ideas Julius Caesar had for the Reformation of Rome actually came from ancient Egypt and Cleopatra.
Absolutely.
So there was a lot of cultural exchange that was happening, that when you get to this point in Julius Caesar's story, like, Cleopatra's kind of been shunted to the side, and we just think, oh, Julius Caesar had this great idea and that great idea, and it's like, oh, all those great ideas came from somewhere.
Yeah, there's a really specific example of that. So the Julian calendar, Julius Caesar is often credited for creating more or less the calendar that we use today. I guess there have been some changes since then, but more or less the calendar we all use today. He was working at the time to develop that calendar with Cleopatra and Cleopatra's astronomers from Egypt. So really we could just as accurately credit Cleopatra with that calendar.
So it shouldn't be the Julian calendar, it should be the Cleopatran.
The Cleopatran calendar. Maybe so. Maybe he just took credit for it.
So Jen, you were going to tell us about Spartacus and how you view him in a different way.
So I feel like most people know the story of Spartacus. I'm not going to get too deep into the weeds about who he was, but he was a gladiator who revolted against Rome, and he led one of the most successful mainland, or I think the only really successful mainland Italian peninsula revolt against the Roman authority. And he was brilliant, and we all know his story, and we all know his story for one reason. In his retinue, Spartacus had a female whose name is literally lost to history. She is only called the Thracian lady. She was a priestess of Dionysus, and she was his spin doctor. She was the one who was spinning the legend about Spartacus that was making it possible for him to grow and for people to believe in him and to follow his leadership. And she did that because, as a priestess of Dionysus, Dionysus was incredibly popular amongst enslaved people, immigrants, Thracians in particular, and he was at a later point in time, the Roman Senate will pass a law outlawing the worship of Dionysus because he was so dangerous. A lot of people who rebelled against Rome took Dionysus as their patron god, like Mithridates, who at the same time the Romans were fighting a war against. They both took Dionysus as their god because he was subversive. And so this priestess was revered by the people who followed her. They all had a shared religion, and she gave Spartacus this sort of divine legend that he was going to win. Like, a lot of the signs and symbols we have attached to Spartacus, like the snake iconography that's involved in his revolution, come back to her. But when we tell the story, we leave her out, which is such a crime. She was either Spartacus's wife, who willingly went into enslavement with him, or she was someone he met while in the ludus. We don't know because, again, history is not interested in telling us that story. But we can weed out how she worked and why she was important. There's another really crucial moment in Spartacus's story where women are involved, and Spartacus and his rebel camp are camped up high in the mountains, and some women have secreted themselves off because it is their time of the month and they need to do whatever purification rituals they need to do or whatever their culture tells them. We don't exactly know because, again, the people who are telling us the story didn't want to get into those details, didn't feel that was necessary. But because these women had taken themselves aside, they saw the advance contingent of Crassus's scouts looking for Spartacus. So they were able to go back, warn the entire camp, and escape. So these are two stories we don't associate with Spartacus, and we should, because if not for these people, well, the revolution would have failed a lot sooner.
Yeah, and it also tells you that women were in his army and participating in the revolution, which isn't like a side of it that you get a lot of the time.
Yeah.
What do you think is the enduring appeal of the ancient world for us, specifically in our culture, and our culture being derived from Western Europe? From, you know, fundamentally, ancient Greece is strong. That's not in Western Europe. Egypt is definitely not part of Western Europe. But culturally, the ancient world, we look back at those civilizations, as well as obviously Rome. What do you think is the enduring appeal of that ancient Mediterranean world for us today?
Oh gosh, I don't know. I mean, it's so well documented. That's one thing. I think that you can really dig into these sources, and you can get all these incredibly juicy stories. And some of it comes from like, some of it you kind of think is propaganda, you know, like things like Caligula making a brothel in the imperial palace and all kinds of crazy stuff like that. But you can also sort of weed through that stuff and try and find grains of truth, which we definitely try to do in our own way, you know. I just think
the amount of times that the imperial palace was turned into a brothel during the Julian Claudian dynasty.
Right.
Was it ever a palace?
That's Caligula. Oh, Elagabalus did it. Well, I guess
Elagabalus, Nero, Caligula.
This is how we answer this question when you're like, what's the enduring appeal? Well, the brothels in the imperial palace.
I think that so much of Western culture has been based on the idea of Greco-Roman democracy and ideals, and there's a massive downfall to that, because the Greco-Roman democracy seems like it's like such a great example, but we did a whole series on the Servile Wars. We're just getting into Spartacus, and a lot of times it just glosses over the fact that the Greco-Roman democracy wasn't democratic for most people. And they had a lot of problems, and you can see that today. Like, that's kind of what we've done. We've built all of our stuff around it, and the stories are enduring. The imagery is like, especially particularly mythology. Imagery from mythology is so iconic. It exists in literature, it exists in artwork, but everything kind of needs to be dug deeper into the history to really understand the problems that we're still experiencing.
There's so much resonance. I think that's one thing. The democracies of the ancient world left so many people out, and that is absolutely the case today.
Yeah.
So when you get to 476, what are you pair going to do? Hang up your podcasting headphones and mic, and then just call it a day and go do something else? What happens when you get to 476?
476.
Well, I think we've talked about. We don't want to just be an ancient Roman, ancient Greek podcast. That's the key thing. Like, we're not going to go through all of ancient Roman history and then end. I think we're going to get to a stopping point and then hopefully shift to maybe some other culture, maybe some other part of the world, and be there for a while and then shift to something else. And I think it's hard to, plan so far in advance, because it turns out that everything we do just takes so much time, But,
yeah. Some of that is because we're not historians, so we are uncovering these incredible moments in history, sometimes for the first time, and we just dig into it, and we really enjoy that, and we enjoy giving that to our listeners, and hopefully they're getting that same experience of digging into the culture around us and that we're researching. And we've talked about eventually we will go to other places in the world. We hear you. We do want to go there as well, but the work that we're doing requires us to do a lot of research and to really dig into the culture. And there's just some things we need to get done where we are first. I mean, the ancient world was not just Rome and the Mediterranean, it was everywhere.
Yeah.
Last question. Obviously, you're going to be speaking at Intelligent Speech on June the 27th. What is going to be your topic, and why have you chosen it?
Jen, why don't you take this one?
So, as I mentioned, this season we're in right now, the big thing was supposed to be the story of Spartacus, and I've been doing research for this for about a year now. And one of the things that I read was about this Thracian lady who was a priestess of Dionysus. So I said to Jenny, I was like, okay, I'm going to have to do an entire episode on Dionysus because he's just so cool. I didn't realize he was so cool. I always just thought he was like the god of a good time and maybe some orgies, which again sounds cool,
wine, theater,
but definitely not a god of revolutionaries and the god of like the lower classes and enslaved people. So I started digging into the research, which wound up being 3 episodes on Dionysus, and they're all good fun. But the second episode is, I think, my favorite episode I've ever written. It's called Dionysus and the Religion of Revolution. So Dionysus was he was the god of wine and celebration and orgies and revolutionaries. And at a certain point in time in Roman history, he was incredibly feared because the people who worshipped him were enslaved people. They were women. Women were the priestesses with the power to let people into the religion.
It was very women-led, this religion.
It was very women-led at this point in time. Yeah. And men over a certain age couldn't be indoctrinated into the religion. So the men who were already grandfathered in, they were fine. But the men who weren't were always like young men who were like, I don't know, maybe before their majority, 16, 18, who were now being influenced very heavily by women and mixing with the social classes and having these late night bacchanals in the woods that the Roman aristocracy and men were not invited to. And so as a result, the Senate became terrified and they had to pass a law to outlaw the religion. And I don't want to give you guys too much because there's a lot to share, but that is where we're coming from with our presentation.
Mm-hmm. And I think this is very much a Hidden Voices story too, because this was a religion of the marginalized at that time. And the fact that it got so powerful was why.
Do you think I could still just about squeeze into that like kind of cult? You know, am I too old?
No, you're fine. You're grandfathered in.
Yeah, you're grandfathered
in. Listen, you have to tell us the name of your podcast one more time.
It's Ancient History Fangirl.
Ancient History Fangirl. It's my favorite podcast if I'm into ancient history from the perspective of 2 fangirls that know a shed load about it, but take you on a journey because they're not historians, but what they are is incredibly passionate about the topic. Jenny and Jen, thank you for coming on to Intelligent Speech to give us a little bit of a taster to see what people can expect on June the 27th.
Absolutely.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much for inviting us.